It's been almost 2 years since the release of Elden Ring, and it is still held as one of the greatest games of this decade. And I shared this sentiment for quite a while. But looking at the comments of my last Elden Ring video, I was reminded of a lot of the issues with the game's mid-game, the game in general, and how people often glance over the issues with the game, especially at launch. Though I want you to remind you, this review will be extremely critical of Elden Ring, but this is not going to be a Quantum TV situation where I tell you to unalive yourself. But as I finished my 8th playthrough of Elden Ring, I reminisced at the issues with the game as well as the pluses of the game. So, now enjoy as I present Elden Ring, an enlightened review. So before I start this, I would like to remind you that I have beaten all the From Software games 3 or more times, except for Dark Souls 2. I couldn't bring myself to finish it more than once. So when looking at Elden Ring, in terms of not only Souls-like but also games in general, it's a phenomenal game, from the gameplay to the story to the open world. Instead of just doing a semi-open world, From Software took this idea to new heights, and instead of dipping their toes in, dunked face first into the concept of an open world. And this open world is quite in depth, and every corner has loot, or an enemy, or just a new exciting experience, and making every encounter unique. The open world is complemented by a phenomenal art style, and though it might not look the best graphically, the From Software art style shines true in this game. Riding through the open world is not only fun, but the art style makes it look and feel smooth. Traversing the open world is easy, and since you're granted a horse, which has a double jump, which makes the traversal of Elden Ring unique, and the varying landscape in this open world adds a semi-strategic side to traversal. But though Elden Ring's open world holds great fun, it also holds some cut corners and disappointment within its grassy fields. Though the world is open and fun to traverse, some of its aspects are held back by a lack of unique enemy design, and rather than create variants, they would much rather spam spawn enemies to make the game's further areas more difficult. Then there's the issues of movement in the levels and open world. When off your horse in Elden Ring, moving through the open world can be downright tedious, and accompanied by some fairly clunky movement in the areas that require precision, it feels less like a challenge and more tedium for the sake of tedium. For instance, in the game, if your horse dies, I think twice, you have to use one of your health things to revive it, but rather than just, when you click on the horse button, use the health item, it would rather ask you and pop open a thing, so when quickly in battle, especially with the fire giant, it would rather open a UI box and have you press yes or no when in a life-threatening situation in the game, which can cost you your souls and annoyance. And Elden Ring has several dungeons, and a lot of these require specific movements to traverse through them, and though the movement is fun when paired with the combat, on its own, it's really nothing special. And in some cases, it kind of hinders the gameplay. In areas such as the sewers of the capital, where precise movements are required, the game movement doesn't often allow for this, as a slight hit of the joystick rotates your character almost a whole 90 degrees, which can make a big difference when trying to do parkour or things like that. But now, moving on to the bosses in the game. When it released, Elden Ring was praised for its hundreds of bosses and unique and interesting boss design that shared things with other iconic enemies in the game and other games, especially from Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Though this was great and the combat was fun, the large scale of Elden Ring brought the boss's downfall, as some that were full of potential, like Praetor Rykard, were left to be slaughtered using a forced-upon gimmick, and several dungeon bosses are clones of bosses and enemies that are weakened or strengthened depending on where in the game you are. Some bosses appear to way too often, like the Death Birds and the Black Knife Assassins, and the repeating of enemies, especially more than twice, without changing movesets, just feels really lazy, and removes the uniqueness of every encounter. Then we move to another issue with the boss design and animation. Some weapons, bosses, and animations are reskins of older ones from the series, and though this is not really that big of an issue, it really feels lazy when looking at other aspects of Elden Ring. And when bosses that look cool and seem dangerous and fun to fight have the same moveset as the Nameless King, it can be pretty disappointing. And as we near the end of our review, it's time to talk about launch issues and the UI. Specifically on the PC, the issues I have are not with the cheesing of bosses before the game was patched, but more the performance of the game at release, as these performance drops are detrimental in any game like this that requires quick reflexes, and and having a slight frame drop and missing even a second of gameplay can cost you your life. And these frame drops would freeze or slow your screen almost completely, and while you think you're alive, it turns out you've been dead for a solid 10 seconds, where all you're looking is at a blur of a tree sentinel. So this would not be that big of a deal if this had happened in game, in a game that required much less quick and strategic timing. But to give props to the devs, these issues were fixed and rarely occur while playing modern day. But then there's the UI, which is kind of old. It feels clunky. It's kind of difficult to know what you're doing if you've never played the game before, and in truth, the game doesn't really hand anything to you, even the UI. So finding out how to properly quit out the game can even be kind of difficult at first. And like I said with the horse thing, quitting out or reviving your horse is pretty difficult. Some to newer players. And though Elden Ring was a great game, it obviously had its flaws, as every game, movie, or book does. And though I think it's a phenomenal game, I believe I'm going to backpedal on my statement in my last video that it's my favorite Souls game, which the title probably belongs to Sekiro or Bloodborne because they were just so fine-tuned and good at what they did. If you haven't checked out Elden Ring, it's a really great game and there's a lot to do, so check it out, and also thank you for 200 subscribers. Alright, bye-bye.